Now, I want to go a little bit further with this comparison of ectotherms versus endotherms and the extent to which they maintain or do not maintain their temperatures. So here you see in the lab an experiment where they had a mouse and they watched the temperature of the mouse and they watched the temperature of a lizard. So a mouse is an endotherm. You can see that it stays relatively constant, so it's also a homeotherm. The lizard on the bottom is an ectotherm, that is, it's going to get almost all of its energy or all its heat from outside, but it's also a heterotherm. That is, its temperature varies quite closely with the temperature of the laboratory that they're being tested in. And of course, these are matching the metabolic rates. So the mouse, as the temperature gets warmer, okay, so that's interesting. So I have these mislabeled here. So the line where the red is decreasing here is actually the mouse, because when they're at the temperature they want to be at, they need the least amount of energy to keep their body processes going, and so their metabolic rate is the lowest. But if it gets colder, their metabolic rate goes up, and if it gets too hot, the metabolic rate also goes up because you need to find ways to reduce your temperature. Whereas the lizard, the actual blue line here, is increasing its metabolic rate as it warms up, because it has the ability to do a lot of things because it has just been warmed by the external environment. So this is in the lab, but if you go out in nature, you see that lizards, ectotherms that are heterotherms also, actually really do regulate their temperature using behavior. So for example, the blue line shows the body temperature of a lizard through the day, and the orange line shows the air temperature at the ground surface, and the green line is the temperature of the burrow that the lizard is in. So at night, the lizard's in the burrow, and so its temperature is the same as the burrow. But then, when the sun comes out in the yellow, it goes outside, and it warms its body up outside. And then it kind of maintains its temperature at what it wants until it gets too hot outside, and then it will go back into its burrow, cool down a bit, maintain its temperature, and then when the temperature outside is no longer too hot, it will come back out of its burrow and do a little bit more foraging before going back into the burrow at the end of the night. And so you see that the lizard temperature is actually relatively constant. So this is called behavioral thermoregulation. That is, by choosing particular microhabitats, small-scale habitats, or doing particular behaviors, even an ectotherm can maintain their temperature relatively constant through the day. So this is one form of thermoregulation, that is behavioral thermoregulation. And in that case, you basically can orient yourself to the heat source. So if you watch marine iguanas, they will orient themselves to the heat source. Or you can bask in the sun, again, marine iguanas, or they can huddle together like emperor penguins, or you can vary whether you're touching a warm surface or not, which lizards do a lot. So when they're cold, they'll go down on a warm surface, but when they're hot, they'll actually stand up off the surface. So convection will be changed. And you can move around during the day. But there's also physiological thermoregulation, such as if you're too hot, you can increase the blood flow to your periphery so that's lost to the environment. Or in mammals, we can sweat to increase evaporative cooling. Or you can pant for the same purpose. Or if you're too cold, you can decrease blood flow to the periphery so it doesn't get cold out to the environment. And you can shiver to generate metabolic heat through activity. And of course, you have a variety of ways of physical thermoregulation as well, including insulation, such as fur or feathers or fat. Just as an aside, there are other thermoregulatory things that organisms do. For example, the countercurrent heat exchanges that I was telling you about earlier are important for mammals to basically not lose too much heat. So for example, the tongue of a gray whale has a countercurrent exchange mechanism so that when its mouth is filled with cold water, it won't lose too much heat. And then also we have brown adipose tissues, which are often stored and then used or burned essentially to warm us up. Now, my favorite example of behavioral thermoregulation is that of the emperor penguins, and it's the easiest to see if you speed the action up.
So here we have a BBC video of emperor penguins in the middle of the Antarctic winter. Those are males with eggs on their feet, and the males spend the whole winter there in up to minus 60 degrees with way worse wind chill. And so the males have to huddle together for warmth. And this is a behavioral thermoregulation mechanism where you basically don't lose any heat because you're pushed up against someone else. Now the penguins rotate around, but then sometimes it will get too hot and all of a sudden they release and you can see all the warm air being released.
Okay, and then physiological thermoregulation, including sweating or shivering. We have our own internal thermostat that if we're getting too cold, it will basically trigger these things as an autonomic response. That is, we don't mentally control it, where we will start to sweat or start to shiver to generate heat or to cause evaporative cooling. And this heat system is in our hypothalamus, which basically creates this negative feedback. If we're too hot, it will cause us to do certain things, but then as we cool down, then we will stop doing those things. And just an example of physical thermoregulation, I mentioned that you can have fat or feathers or fur, which will keep you warm. And there's a really cool example of a thermal camera looking at a seal that has an injury in the upper right there, where you can see a lot of heat being released from the eyes, where you don't have protection of fat, feathers, or fur. But you also have an injury on the upper right there where the blubber, the fat that's protecting the seal has been damaged, and so you can see a lot of heat loss through that. Rabbits that live in hot temperatures, they have large ears, so they can basically pump a lot of blood into them, which will allow them to lose heat from their ears. Whereas things that are found in cold environments, such as the Arctic hare, have very small ears, and they also have a lot of hair on them, so that they don't lose a lot of heat through their ears. Now, I've alluded to several times in this course how the lungs of birds are really, really special. And so I want to return to that now and tell you a little bit about the lungs of birds. Now, you can imagine that flying and endothermy, producing your own heat, requires a large amount of energy and therefore a large amount of oxygen. So that is true, but at the same time, some birds can fly in very high elevations, like 30,000 feet over Mount Everest, where there's very little oxygen. So they have to be really efficient at getting oxygen from the environment. And so they have this really cool respiratory system that's much more complex and efficient than us mammals. So when we breathe, we have what's called tidal air exchange. We breathe in, it goes in, and then we breathe out, and it comes back out, like a tide moving in and out. But birds don't have that. Instead, they have unidirectional flow through their lungs. And the way they can do that is because they have a bunch of air sacs that are not the lungs. So they have anterior and posterior air sacs that connect to the airway and the lungs. So when you breathe in, when a bird breathes in the first time, the air doesn't go into the lungs. Instead, what it does is it goes into the posterior air sacs. That's their first breath in. Then when they breathe out, that air goes into the lungs. Then when they breathe in the next time, the air that was in the lungs goes into the anterior air sacs from the lungs. And then when they breathe out again, that air then goes out from the anterior air sacs out of the body. That's much more efficient because when we breathe in, we can only breathe in some new air and we can't breathe out all the old air. Birds can get a lot more of the oxygen out of the air because they don't have to mix them in the lungs every time. So obviously it takes 2 cycles for the air that a bird breathes in to get out again. I wish we had lungs like that. Now, the other thing that birds are obvious for talking about is the evolution of flight. Now, flight didn't evolve just in birds. It's evolved at least 4 times in the history of life. And those include insects that fly, also pterosaurs. So you might not be familiar with pterosaurs. There's just a cartoon example of pterosaurs. And then birds and bats, of course. So we've talked a bit about bats already, the vampire bat in the last lecture. They also have flight, of course. Those are all separate evolutionary origins of flight. Now, there's been many other origins of gliding, including gliding frogs and gliding snakes and gliding fish and a whole bunch of things like that. But that's not flying. That's not powered flight. So this is an example of convergent evolution where you have similarities that evolved due to a common environment, not because they came from a common ancestor. Now, birds have a number of cool adaptations for flight. Here's a list of some of them. One is hollow bones. So here is a bird bone, and you can see it's damaged at the end here, but basically you have, it's hollow on the inside, which makes it quite light, and then you have these struts that reinforce it so it doesn't break. Although bird bones do break, of course. They also have a sternum, this bone right here, that is enlarged and has a keel. That is a projection off of it like this, which is for the attachment of flight muscles. And so on the bottom there you have a sword-billed hummingbird, and you can see this incredible keel that's coming off the sternum for the attachment of flight muscles, as well as the incredibly long beak that's longer than the rest of the body for probing in flowers. And of course, birds have feathers. Now, I mentioned before that this is one of the clear links to theropod dinosaurs, and we know that you can look at fossils that have clear imprints of feathers on them, such as on the upper right. That's a dinosaur, not a bird. And then on the left there you have amber that has preserved dinosaur feathers in them. Now, feathers have many different functions. They're used for insulation, flight, for sensory structures, for lining nests. And they're composed of this beta keratin, which is the same structure that was basically waterproofing the skin of reptiles. So this is clearly their reptile ancestry. And they still have some of those reptile-like scales on their legs rather than feathers. Now, there are a bunch of different types of feathers. There's a cool book about feathers that I read that I highly recommend. You can't just pick up owls off the road. You have to have a permit for it. But here's one that my parents got a permit for, and this is a great horned owl. And they have a series of different feathers used for different purposes, including tail feathers here. You have flight feathers on the side. Here are the tail feathers of a ruffed grouse. You have flight feathers. And then you have a series of other feathers, including on the inside down. So my nice down jacket, of course, your down jacket is filled with the interior downy feathers of birds. You can also have feathers that are used for signaling, such as these feathers on the top. Or the really cool diverse feathers of that birds of paradise use for signaling to mates. Crazy stuff. Here's some really specialized ostrich feathers. Of course, if you don't fly anymore, you don't need your feathers for flight, and so ostriches have used them for display mainly. Here's a much smaller owl. This is called a Saw-whet Owl, which also was hit on the road, and my parents got a permit to have this bird. Probably one of the more incredibly highly specialized feathers for display, which would be the feathers of the peacock. Of course, feathers aren't the only thing that are highly specialized in birds. They also have highly specialized feet, including like the webbed feet of a duck, or, for example, the incredible feet of the great horned owl there, which are used to grab mice as they hunt. And you remember in the video, at the start, there was a barred owl that was going down and grabbing mice.
Normally, I travel all over the world in the winter. But because of COVID, of course, last year I was completely locked down. So after I made this particular video, I spent a lot of time exploring and taking pictures of owls around near my house in Montreal. And there were 5 different species, including many of the ones I've mentioned already in this lecture. This is a barred owl, and there were a couple of barred owls near my house that just kind of hung out during the day and then waited for animals at night to move around under the snow, and then they would dive down and with their very acute hearing, catch them in the snow. Another really cool bird that I saw and photographed and took a video of this winter was the Saw-whet Owl, another one of the ones that I showed you my parents had collected and that we had a permit to keep. So you see, this Saw-whet Owl has some sort of small mammal that it's eaten, and for the most part, they swallow these small mammals whole. Now that means that they've got a bunch of bones and fur and things like that inside their gut when they're digesting, and they have a second way of excreting that. Sure, they poop out a bunch of stuff that's processed by their stomach, but they also form what are called pellets. And so they regurgitate some of the bones and fur and feathers in a pellet. And there are many classroom exercises where you can dissect these pellets and try to understand the organisms that are in them, almost always small mammals. This particular saw-whet owl was regurgitating its pellet, but it got stuck on a branch, and it was just kind of not paying much attention, and it was just hanging there until he eventually figured it out and let it go. A particularly rare owl in the area, which was present last winter, is the great gray owl. These are absolutely spectacular owls, really big, and closely related to the great horned owl that I showed you previously. There were also great horned owls present at this location, but I did not get a close look at them. So they just hang out during the day. You can get quite close to them, although obviously you don't want to bother them. And you can get really good pictures and videos and just see these amazingly cool animals in the wild. When I was a kid growing up in Alberta, snowy owls were one of the coolest things. These are Arctic specialized owls that fly south in winter and then hang out in fields where they can hunt in open fields. So here's a snowy owl just north of Montreal that I heard about and was able to head up and take a video of beside the road. Spectacular animal.
Okay, so I want to close with a discussion of how did this transition to flight occur? Because we know dinosaurs are running around. They couldn't fly. But one branch of them used those existing feathers, which had probably evolved for thermoregulation, to all of a sudden modify them and actually get up in the air and become birds. So there are two main hypotheses. One of these is called the ground-up hypothesis, where the idea is that theropod dinosaurs like velociraptors were running around and maybe sticking out their arms with the feathers on them and maybe gliding short distances, and then that eventually evolved into flapping flight. The other one is that these were arboreal, that is tree-living small dinosaurs who were basically jumping out of trees, and then they evolved gliding, and that the feathers extended for that purpose, and then from there they evolved flapping flight. So what do you guys think? Do you think the ground-up hypothesis seems more likely to you, or the trees down hypothesis, or you have, no idea? Okay, I'm going to end this lecture there. And I'm going to come back with a poll after this, and then I'll give you the final answer to this question after we do the poll.